The autumn rain drummed steadily against the corrugated metal roof of Collin Aviation, each drop echoing through the cavernous hangar like a melancholy symphony. Edward Collin wiped grease-stained hands on his worn coveralls, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights hanging from rusted chains above. At 42, he carried the weight of 2 decades maintaining aircraft, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he was staring at something that didn't belong in his humble repair shop on the outskirts of Millbrook Valley. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The 1943 North American P-51 Mustang sat like a sleeping giant among his usual clientele of crop dusters and weekend recreational planes. Her silver fuselage, though dulled by decades and neglect, still held the unmistakable grace of wartime engineering. Someone had painted Desert Rose in faded red script along her nose, and despite the years of hangar rash and surface corrosion, Marcus could see the magnificent machine she once was. 3 mechanics before you said she'd never fly again, came a voice from behind him, crisp and cultured, cutting through the ambient sounds of rain and distant thunder. Edward turned slowly, his steel-toed boots scraping against the oil-stained concrete. The woman standing in his hangar doorway seemed as out of place as her aircraft. Tall and elegant, with auburn hair pulled back in a sophisticated knot, she wore a tailored cream-colored coat that probably cost more than Edward made in 6 months. Her dark eyes held an intensity that spoke of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted, yet there was something else there, a vulnerability that her confident posture couldn't quite conceal. "Ma'am," Edward nodded respectfully, instinctively straightening his shoulders. "I'm Edward Collin. You must be Miss—" He waited, realizing he'd only spoken with her assistant over the phone. "Victoria Ashworth," she said, stepping into the hangar with measured grace. Her heels clicked against the concrete as she approached, and Marcus noticed how she moved, like someone who'd spent time around aircraft, confident but respectful of the machinery. "Though everyone calls me Tori, this beautiful lady belonged to my grandfather." Marcus's expression softened. Family planes always carried more than mechanical challenges. They carried memories, stories, and dreams that couldn't be measured in horsepower or wing loading. "She's a beauty, Miss Ashworth, 1943 P51D, if I'm reading the serial numbers right. Merlin engine, originally built for the European theater." "You know your history," Tori said, a note of genuine appreciation in her voice. "Grandfather flew her in the Pacific. She brought him home from 12 combat missions before the war ended." She reached out to touch the wing, her manicured fingers tracing the rivets with reverence. "After the war, he converted her for civilian use. Air racing mostly, some exhibition flying. She was his pride and joy until—" "Until?" Edward prompted gently when she trailed off. "Until the accident 15 years ago. Grandfather was 78, still flying aerobatics when he should have been playing golf." Her smile was sad but proud. "Emergency landing in a cornfield. He walked away without a scratch, but Desert Rose," she gestured at the aircraft. "She's been in storage ever since. Grandfather made me promise that someday she'd fly again." Edward walked slowly around the Mustang, his trained eye cataloging the work needed. The fabric control surfaces showed signs of deterioration, the landing gear would need complete overhaul, and the engine hadn't run in over a decade. It would be a massive undertaking, requiring parts that were increasingly rare and expensive. Most shops would quote a restoration cost that exceeded the aircraft's value. "The other mechanics," Edward said carefully, "what exactly did they tell you?" Tori's jaw tightened slightly. "That it would be cheaper to buy a flying P-51 than restore this one. That some planes are better off as static displays. That I should let her go to a museum and accept that her flying days are over." She met his eyes directly. "What do you think, Mr. Collin?" Edward continued his inspection, running his hands along the propeller blades, checking the engine mounts, peering into the cockpit where dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. This wasn't just about money or mechanical complexity. This was about legacy, about keeping promises to the dead, about the kind of commitment that went beyond simple business transactions. "I think," he said finally, straightening up and meeting her gaze, "that your grandfather didn't survive 12 combat missions and 78 years of living just to have his airplane become a museum piece. She's got good bones, solid airframe. The engine's a Packard Merlin. They built them to last. It won't be cheap, and it won't be quick, but—" He paused, thinking of his own father, killed in a construction accident when Edward was just starting his aviation career. Thinking of promises made and kept, of legacies passed down through grease-stained hands and hard-earned wisdom. "But she can fly again," he finished with quiet conviction. Something shifted in Tori's expression. Relief, perhaps, or recognition of finding someone who understood. "The other mechanics quoted me between $800,000 and $1.2 million. 6 months minimum, assuming they could even source the parts." Edward nodded slowly. Those numbers weren't wrong, exactly, but they reflected shop rates and profit margins that had more to do with overhead than actual restoration work. "Miss Ashworth, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why is this so important to you, really?" Tori was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. "Because I was supposed to learn to fly in her. Grandfather promised to teach me when I turned 16, but my parents thought it was too dangerous, too expensive, too impractical." She touched the wing again, and Marcus saw her hand tremble slightly. "By the time I was old enough to make my own decisions, the accident had happened. I've spent the last 15 years building a software company, making enough money to restore anything I wanted. But money can't bring back time, Mr. Rodriguez. It can't give me those flying lessons with the man who raised me." "Your parents?" Marcus asked gently. "Died in a car accident when I was 8. Grandfather stepped in, taught me everything about honor, about keeping your word, about the difference between existing and truly living." Her voice grew stronger. "He used to say that some things in life are worth preserving not because they're practical, but because they remind us who we are." Edward looked at the P-51 again, seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't just a restoration project. It was a bridge across time, a chance to honor the dead by bringing their dreams back to life. He thought of his own 8-year-old son Tommy, asleep in their small apartment above the hangar office, dreaming of airplanes and adventures while his father worked late into the night just to keep the bills paid. "Miss Ashworth," he said finally, "I can restore your grandfather's airplane, but I have to be honest with you. My shop isn't fancy, I don't have a big crew, and I work mostly on utility aircraft. This would be the biggest project I've ever taken on." "What would you charge?" she asked quietly. Edward did rapid calculations in his head. Parts costs, labor hours, the reality of his overhead versus the big restoration shops. 400,000, parts and labor. 12 to 18 months, depending on how hard it is to source original components. "And Miss Ashworth?" He met her eyes again. "If we do this, we do it right. No shortcuts, no substitutions unless absolutely necessary. Your grandfather's airplane deserves nothing less than perfection." Tori extended her hand, and when Edward shook it, he felt the calluses that suggested she knew something about working with her hands. "When can you start, Mr. Collin?" As thunder rolled across the valley and rain continued its steady percussion against the hangar roof, Edward Collin realized he'd just committed to the challenge of a lifetime. But looking at the hope in Victoria Ashworth's eyes, thinking of her grandfather's legacy and his own son's future, he knew some opportunities were worth any risk. What neither of them realized as they stood beside the sleeping warbird in that weathered hangar was that restoring Desert Rose would change far more than just her ability to fly. Sometimes the most important journeys don't happen in the sky at all. They happen in the quiet moments between two people who dare to believe that some dreams are worth fighting for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first rays of dawn painted the Millbrook Valley in shades of amber and gold as Edward Collin's weathered pickup truck rumbled down the gravel road toward Collin Aviation. The radio crackled with the morning weather report. Clear skies, light winds, perfect flying conditions that would bring weekend pilots out in droves. Good for business, if he could keep up with the demand. Edward pulled into his usual spot beside the hangar, the truck's engine coughing twice before settling into silence. Through the windshield, he could see Desert Rose exactly where they'd left her the night before, her silver wings catching the early light like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria Ashworth had shaken his hand and changed his life forever. "Dad, you're up early even for you," came a sleepy voice from the passenger seat. 8-year-old Tommy Collin rubbed his eyes and stretched, his unruly brown hair sticking up in all directions. The boy had insisted on sleeping in the truck last night after Edward had worked past midnight on the initial assessment of the P-51's engine. Tommy's dedication to spending time with his father both warmed Edward's heart and broke it. No 8-year-old should have to camp out in hangar offices just to see his dad. "Sorry, buddy. Big day ahead of us," Edward said, ruffling his son's hair. "Mrs. Patterson is picking you up for school in an hour, but I wanted to show you something first." They walked into the hangar together, Tommy's small hand tucked securely in Edward's calloused palm. The morning light, streaming through the high windows, transformed the space, making even the most utilitarian tools look dignified. Edward had inherited this hangar from his mentor, old Bill Mackenzie, who taught him that aircraft maintenance was part science, part art, and all heart. "Whoa," Tommy breathed, seeing Desert Rose in full daylight for the first time. "She's really something, isn't she, Dad?" "That she is, son." Edward pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages filled with decades of maintenance records, sketches, and notes. Bill had kept meticulous records of every aircraft that passed through these doors, and Edward had continued the tradition. "This airplane flew in World War II, Tommy. Can you imagine? Men not much older than me, climbing into that cockpit, flying halfway around the world to fight for freedom." Tommy approached the P-51 with the reverence children reserve for truly special things. "Is she really going to fly again?" "If we do our job right, she will." Edward opened the journal to a fresh page, writing Desert Rose Initial Assessment in his careful script. "But it's going to take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. Like when you fixed Mr. Peterson's crop duster last month?" Edward smiled. "Much harder than that, buddy. This is like... Well, imagine if someone gave you a 1,000-piece puzzle, but half the pieces were missing and you had to make new ones by hand." The hangar's side door opened with a familiar squeak, and Margaret Patterson entered carrying a thermos of coffee and a paper bag that smelled like fresh-baked muffins. At 65, Maggie was the unofficial mother hen of Millbrook Valley's small aviation community, a retired school teacher who'd taken it upon herself to help Edward with Tommy ever since Sarah, Edward's wife, had died 3 years ago in a car accident. "Thought you two might be hungry," she said, setting the bag on Edward's workbench. "And Edward Collin, that boy needs proper breakfast before school, not hangar coffee and determination." "Yes, ma'am," Edward grinned, accepting the coffee gratefully. Maggie's scolding came from a place of love, and both he and Tommy treasured her maternal attention. Tommy dove into one of the muffins with 8-year-old enthusiasm, while Edward reviewed his notes from the previous evening. The engine inspection had revealed both good news and challenges. The Packard Merlin V12 was in better condition than expected. Bill Mackenzie had taught him to read the stories that metal told, and this engine spoke of careful maintenance and respect. However, the fuel system would need complete overhaul, several cylinders showed compression issues, and the propeller governor was seized solid. "Mr. Edward," Maggie said quietly, settling onto a stool beside his workbench, "I don't mean to pry, but this restoration, it's going to be expensive. Are you sure this Miss Ashworth is good for the money?" Edward had wondered the same thing. Victoria Ashworth's clothes and manner suggested wealth, but he'd learned not to judge a book by its cover. However, she'd already transferred a $50,000 deposit to his account, money that had allowed him to pay off 2 months of overdue bills and stock up on basic supplies. "She paid a substantial deposit," he said carefully, "and Maggie, this could change everything for Tommy and me. If I can pull this off, word will spread. Warbird restoration is a specialized field, and there aren't many shops that can do it right." "Just don't forget who you are in the process," Maggie said, her teacher's intuition sensing something Edward hadn't quite articulated. "Success can be as dangerous as failure if it makes you lose sight of what matters." Tommy finished his muffin and wandered over to examine the P-51's cockpit, his young imagination clearly spinning tales of aerial combat and heroic adventures. Edward watched his son with pride and concern in equal measure. Tommy was brilliant for his age, already reading at a 6th-grade level and showing an intuitive understanding of mechanical principles. But he was also growing up too fast, taking on responsibilities that should belong to adults. "Dad, what's this?" Tommy pointed to a small metal plaque mounted inside the cockpit. Edward climbed up beside his son and read aloud, "Captain James Ashworth, 332nd Fighter Squadron, fortune favors the bold." He looked at Tommy with new understanding. That must be Miss Ashworth's grandfather, the man who flew this airplane in the war. Fortune favors the bold, Tommy repeated thoughtfully. Does that mean brave people get lucky? I think it means that sometimes you have to take risks to achieve great things, Edward said, thinking of his own decision to take on this restoration. But you have to be smart about it too. Brave doesn't mean reckless. The sound of another vehicle approaching drew their attention. Through the hangar's open doors, they could see a sleek black sedan pulling into the gravel parking area. Victoria Ashworth emerged, but this morning she looked different. Less corporate, more approachable. She wore dark jeans, a simple white blouse, and practical boots, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger, more accessible. "Miss Ashworth," Edward called out, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, approaching with a genuine smile. "I kept thinking about Desert Rose, wondering how she looked in the morning light." Her eyes found the airplane, and Edward saw the same expression of wonder that had crossed Tommy's face moments earlier. "Ma'am, I'm Tommy," his son said with the direct confidence that Edward both admired and occasionally worried about. "Dad says your grandfather was a war hero." Tori's expression softened completely. "He was indeed, Tommy, one of the bravest men I ever knew." She knelt to Tommy's eye level. "Would you like to hear some stories about him while your dad shows me what he's discovered about Desert Rose?" As Edward began his detailed explanation of the restoration process, pointing out specific challenges and proposed solutions, he found himself impressed by Tori's questions. She didn't just nod politely. She engaged with genuine curiosity about mechanical processes, asked intelligent follow-up questions, and demonstrated a surprising familiarity with aircraft systems. "You know something about airplanes," he observed during a lull in the technical discussion. "Grandfather taught me the basics before—" She paused, glancing at Tommy, who was hanging on every word. "Before he stopped flying. I've been reading everything I can find about P-51 restoration since I inherited Desert Rose. Your approach is different from what the other shops proposed." "How so?" "They wanted to modernize everything. Digital engine management, updated avionics, structural modifications for easier maintenance." "You're talking about returning her to original specifications, even when it's more difficult and expensive." Edward nodded slowly. "Modern modifications might make her more reliable, but they'd also make her a different airplane. Your grandfather's Desert Rose would be gone forever, replaced by something that just looks like her." He ran his hand along the wing's leading edge. "Sometimes the hard way is the right way." Tori met his eyes, and Edward saw recognition there. The look of someone who understood that some things were worth preserving exactly as they were, regardless of convenience or cost. "Mr. Edward," Maggie called from the workbench, "it's time to get this young man to school." As Tommy gathered his backpack and hugged his father goodbye, Edward realized that this restoration project was already changing his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in 3 years, he felt genuinely excited about the future, energized by a challenge that would test every skill he'd learned in 20 years of aviation maintenance. "Miss Ashworth," he said as Maggie and Tommy headed for the door, "would you like to stay and help me start the engine tear down? Fair warning, it's going to be dirty, tedious work." Tori's smile was radiant. "Mr. Collin, I wouldn't miss it for the world." As they rolled up their sleeves and began the careful process of disassembling the Packard Merlin engine, Edward reflected on how much his life had changed in just 3 weeks. The financial pressure that had kept him awake at night was lifting, replaced by the exciting challenge of bringing a legendary aircraft back to life. And there was something else, something he wasn't quite ready to name yet, about the way Tori looked at him when he explained complex mechanical processes, the way she listened as if his words mattered beyond their technical content. Outside, Millbrook Valley was waking up to another beautiful autumn day. Inside the hangar, 2 people from very different worlds were discovering they had more in common than either had expected, united by respect for craftsmanship, honor for the past, and hope for the future. Tommy was right, Edward thought, as he carefully removed the first cylinder head. Fortune did favor the bold. The question was whether he would be brave enough to recognize all the opportunities this restoration might offer, not just for Desert Rose, but for his own heart as well. The glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower offered a commanding view of downtown Portland, But Victoria Ashworth found herself staring instead at her reflection in the polished mahogany table. Around her, 12 executives from Ashworth Digital Solutions debated quarterly projections and market expansion strategies, their voices blending into a familiar corporate symphony that had once energized her but now felt increasingly hollow. "Victoria, the Seattle acquisition is waiting for your approval," said James Morrison, her chief operating officer, sliding a leather portfolio across the table. "The due diligence is complete, and the numbers look exceptional. This could expand our Pacific Northwest presence by 40%. Tori picked up the documents, scanning figures that represented months of work by her acquisition team. On paper, it was perfect. A mid-sized software company specializing in cloud-based logistics solutions, exactly the kind of strategic purchase that had built her empire over the past 15 years. The profit margins were healthy, the client base stable, and the asking price reasonable. "What's the timeline?" she asked, though her mind wandered to the smell of aviation fuel and the satisfying weight of a wrench in her hands. "They want a decision by Friday," replied Sarah Chen, her head of mergers and acquisitions. "The founders are eager to retire, and we're competing with 2 other offers." Tori nodded absently, remembering how different decisions had felt just a week ago in Edward's hangar. When he'd quoted his restoration price, there had been no committees, no lengthy analysis, no risk assessments. Just 2 people shaking hands over something that mattered beyond quarterly earnings. "Victoria?" James's voice carried a note of concern. "You seem distracted lately. Is everything all right?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that went beyond simple workplace wellness. James had been with her company since the early days, had seen her build Ashworth Digital from a one-woman startup in her grandfather's garage to a regional powerhouse employing over 800 people. He'd also been asking her out for dinner for the past 3 years, his interest never quite crossing professional lines, but always present nonetheless. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then caught herself. When had "fine" become her default response to everything? "Actually, I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what we're really building here." The conference room fell silent. Around the table, expensive suits and carefully crafted presentations seemed suddenly insignificant. These were good people, talented professionals who'd helped her create something substantial. But looking at their faces now, Tori realized she couldn't remember the last time any of them had talked about passion, about dreams that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets. "Legacy is market share," said Marcus Webb, her aggressive young VP of development. "It's patents filed, competitors acquired, shareholders satisfied. We're building a tech dynasty here, Victoria. Your grandfather would be proud." But would he? Tori thought of Captain James Ashworth, who'd risked his life flying combat missions not for profit margins but for principles. Who'd spent his post-war years teaching young pilots, giving flying lessons to farm kids who couldn't afford fancy flight schools, treating aviation as a calling rather than just a business. "Actually," she said slowly, "I think my grandfather would have questions about what we're building." He believed in creating things that made people's lives better, not just more efficient. James leaned forward, his business instincts clearly concerned. "Victoria, our software solutions help millions of people manage their logistics more effectively. We're saving companies billions in operational costs. That's meaningful impact." He wasn't wrong, but his words felt flat, corporate speak that reduced human experience to optimization algorithms. Tori thought of Tommy Cullen's excitement as he'd explored Desert Rose's cockpit, of Edward's careful hands restoring something beautiful and important. When had she stopped seeing that kind of wonder in her own work? "The Seattle acquisition," she said finally. "Table it for now, I need more time to think." The room erupted in carefully modulated protests. Market timing, competitor advantages, seller impatience, all valid concerns from people who understood business far better than they understood the restlessness growing in her chest. "Victoria," Sarah Chen said carefully, "this represents 18 months of relationship building. If we delay, we risk losing credibility in the acquisition market." "Then we'll deal with that risk," Tori replied, surprised by her own certainty. "Schedule a follow-up meeting for next week. I want everyone to spend the weekend thinking about why we do what we do, not just how well we do it." As the meeting dispersed, James lingered, his expression mixing professional concern with personal worry. "Tori, what's really going on? You've been different since you took that trip to Oregon. More distant." Distant. The word stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. She had been pulling away from her carefully constructed corporate life, spending her evenings researching P-51 restoration techniques instead of reviewing quarterly reports. Her assistant had started scheduling meetings around her frequent trips to Millbrook Valley, though Tori hadn't explained why she needed to be there so often. "James, do you remember when we started this company, what we talked about during those 18-hour days in my grandfather's garage?" His smile was genuine, touching the part of him that existed before stock options and strategic planning. "We were going to change the world. Make technology more human, more accessible. You said you wanted to build something your grandfather would understand, even though he'd never used a computer." "Exactly." Tori moved to the conference room's windows, looking out at the city where 800 people depended on her decisions. "Somewhere along the way, we started building for shareholders instead of people. When was the last time you were excited about what we do, James?" "Really excited? The way you were when we landed our first major client?" James was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried an honesty that rarely surfaced in corporate settings. "I don't know. Maybe when we developed the emergency logistics protocol for disaster relief organizations, but that was 2 years ago." 2 years. Tori realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt genuine excitement about her work, the kind of satisfaction that came from creating something meaningful rather than simply profitable. Yet in Edward's hangar, surrounded by the smell of metal and oil, she'd felt more alive in 3 weeks than she had in 3 years of corporate success. "I've been working on a personal project," she said carefully, "restoring my grandfather's airplane. It's taught me something about the difference between efficiency and excellence, between building things that work and building things that matter." "Vintage aircraft restoration?" James's business mind immediately began calculating angles. "There might be interesting applications for our project management software in specialized manufacturing sectors. Have you considered the market potential?" And there it was, the reflexive reduction of everything to business opportunity. Tori felt a flash of irritation, then sadness. When had they all become so programmed to see dollar signs, instead of simply seeing beauty, challenge, or human connection? "It's not about business, James. It's about honoring something important, about working with someone who understands craftsmanship in ways we've forgotten." She paused, realizing she'd revealed more than intended. "The mechanic I'm working with, he approaches problems differently. He takes time to understand what something was meant to be before deciding how to fix it." James's expression shifted, and Tori saw him processing the personal implications of her words. "This mechanic, is he why you've been spending so much time in Oregon?" The question hung between them, loaded with professional and personal ramifications. Tori thought of Edward's careful hands guiding her through engine disassembly, the way he listened when she talked about her grandfather, the quiet strength he showed in raising Tommy alone. There was something growing between them, something she wasn't ready to name but couldn't ignore. "He's helping me remember who I used to be," she said finally. Before quarterly reports and acquisition strategies became more important than actually building something worthwhile. Through the conference room's glass walls, she could see her employees working at their stations, talented, dedicated people who joined Ashworth Digital because they believed in her vision. But somewhere along the way, that vision had gotten lost in the machinery of corporate growth. "James, I want you to do something for me. Cancel my appointments for the rest of the week. I need to spend some time in Oregon, working with my hands instead of just my spreadsheets." "Victoria, the Morrison Technologies presentation is Thursday, and the board meeting can be rescheduled." She gathered her things, feeling lighter with each decision to step away from her corporate obligations. "And James?" "Start thinking about what would happen if we made decisions based on what we're passionate about rather than what's most profitable. I have a feeling we might discover we've been solving the wrong problems." As she walked toward the elevator, Tori caught her reflection in the polished corporate surfaces that lined the hallway. Designer suit, perfect makeup, every detail calculated to project success and authority. But behind her professional mask, she was becoming someone else. Someone who found more satisfaction in learning to rebuild a carburetor than in reviewing profit and loss statements. The elevator descended 42 floors, carrying her from the rarefied air of corporate success back towards something more fundamental. By tomorrow morning, she'd be back in Edward's hangar, wearing work clothes and learning the satisfaction that came from building something beautiful with her own hands. For the first time in years, Victoria Ashworth couldn't wait to get dirty. The engine components spread across Edward's workbench told a story of decades in neglect, each part carefully tagged and photographed before disassembly. 6 weeks into the restoration, he discovered both encouraging signs and sobering challenges. The Packard Merlin's internals showed less wear than expected, but sourcing authentic replacement parts was proving more difficult and expensive than his initial estimates. "Dad, you've got that worried look again," Tommy observed from his homework station in the corner of the hangar. The 8-year-old had developed an uncanny ability to read his father's moods, a skill born from 3 years of being Edward's primary confidant and companion. "Just running numbers, buddy." Edward replied, though worried was an understatement. The parts catalog spread before him showed replacement costs that made his stomach tighten. Original Packard Merlin pistons, if he could find them, would run $8,000 each, and he needed 12. The propeller governor rebuild alone would cost more than his truck was worth. The hangar's side door opened, bringing with it the crisp November air and the sound of Tori's approaching footsteps. Over the past 6 weeks, she'd established a routine of arriving early each morning, trading her executive attire for work clothes, and diving into the restoration with an enthusiasm that both impressed and puzzled Edward. Today, however, something was different. She carried herself with a new determination, and her usual morning coffee was replaced by a leather portfolio that looked distinctly corporate. "Morning, Edward. Tommy." She greeted them both warmly, but her eyes quickly found the parts catalog and Edward's troubled expression. "Bad news?" Edward gestured to the spreadsheet on his laptop screen. "Reality catching up with optimism. Some of these parts are rarer than I anticipated. There's a cylinder head assembly I need that only 3 companies in the world can rebuild, and the waiting list is 8 months minimum." Tori set down her portfolio and moved to examine the engine components, her hands now confident enough to identify parts that had been mysteries to her just weeks earlier. Edward had watched her transform from a cautious observer to someone who could strip a carburetor and reassemble it without hesitation. Her grandfather's mechanical aptitude had apparently skipped a generation, only to resurface when given the right opportunity. "What if money weren't a factor?" she asked quietly. "What if we could buy whatever parts we needed, hire specialists for the complex rebuilds, source original components regardless of cost?" Edward looked up sharply. "Miss Ashworth, we agreed on $400,000. I won't take advantage of your generosity just because I underestimated some costs." Edward. Her use of his first name still sent a small thrill through him, though he tried to ignore such feelings. What if this weren't just about restoring Desert Rose? What if it were about something bigger? She opened the portfolio, revealing documents that made Edward's eyes widen. Aircraft registration papers, hangar lease agreements, business incorporation forms, all bearing the name Heritage Flight Services, with both their names listed as principals. "I've been thinking about what you said the first day we met," Tori continued, settling onto the stool beside his workbench, "about how there aren't many shops that can do warbird restoration properly, about how this work preserves history, not just machines." Tommy had abandoned his homework and crept closer, his young ears picking up the gravity in the adults' conversation. Edward's mind raced, trying to process what Tori was proposing while simultaneously cataloging all the reasons it could never work. "Tori, I appreciate the thought, but I'm a small-town mechanic. I don't know anything about running a specialized restoration business, dealing with collectors who own million-dollar aircraft, managing the kind of operation you're talking about." "But you know the work," she said firmly. "You understand what these machines meant to the people who flew them. That's what matters most." She pulled out another document, this one showing financial projections that made Edward's head spin. "I've done research over the past month. There are fewer than a dozen shops in North America that specialize in authentic warbird restoration. The waiting lists are years long, and most of them focus on profit over authenticity." Edward studied the business plan, recognizing the corporate precision that had built Ashworth Digital Solutions. Market analysis, competitive positioning, financial forecasting, all applied to the world of vintage aircraft restoration. It was impressive, comprehensive, and absolutely terrifying. "The learning curve would be enormous," he said carefully. "Insurance, certifications, regulatory compliance for military aircraft. And Tommy," he glanced at his son who was listening with wide eyes. "This is his home, his school, his friends, everything familiar." "Actually," Tori said softly, "I've been thinking about that too." She pulled out a real estate listing that made Edward's breath catch. The property showed a magnificent facility an hour north of Portland, a restored 1940s military airfield complete with multiple hangars, a control tower, and a 5,000-foot runway. Cascade Field. It was a training base during World War II, decommissioned in 1946. The current owner is retiring and looking for someone who'll preserve its historical significance. The photos showed buildings that could house a dozen major restoration projects simultaneously, workshop spaces that Edward could only dream of, and living quarters that would provide a real home for him and Tommy. But the asking price was in the millions, money that represented a different universe from his current reality. "I could never afford something like this," Edward said, though he couldn't take his eyes off the images. "You wouldn't be buying it alone." Tori's voice carried a vulnerability he hadn't heard before. "Edward, over the past 6 weeks, I've remembered what it feels like to build something meaningful. Working with my hands, solving real problems, creating something beautiful that honors the past while serving the future." She paused, looking at her hands, now permanently stained with honest work. "I want to step away from the corporate world. Not completely. Ashworth Digital can run itself with the right management structure. But I want to do something that matters." Tommy had crept close enough to peer at the airfield photos over Edward's shoulder. "Dad, look at that runway. You could land anything there. And there's a whole museum building where people could learn about the airplanes you fix." Edward felt the walls of his carefully controlled life shifting, expanding into possibilities he'd never dared imagine. But with opportunity came risk, and he'd learned the hard way that big dreams could lead to devastating failures. "Tori, what you're proposing, it would change everything. For both of us, for Tommy. What if it doesn't work? What if we take these risks and fail?" She met his eyes directly, and he saw in them the same determination that had built a tech company from nothing. "What if we succeed? What if we create something that preserves history while building a future? Edward, you've already proven you can restore Desert Rose. This would just be doing the same thing on a larger scale, with better resources and a partner who believes in the mission." The word partner hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went beyond business arrangements. Edward had caught himself watching Tori work, had noticed the way she laughed at Tommy's jokes, had felt something shift in his chest when she'd arrived each morning. But mixing business with personal feelings was dangerous territory, especially when his son's future hung in the balance. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "To talk with Tommy, research what would be involved, understand the full scope of what you're proposing." "Of course." Tori began gathering the documents, but her movements were careful, respectful of the magnitude of what she'd just suggested. "Edward, I know this seems overwhelming, but I've spent 15 years building something successful that left me feeling empty. Working here, with you, on Desert Rose, it's the first time in years I've felt genuinely excited about getting up each morning." After she left, Edward sat in the quiet hangar with Tommy, both of them staring at the partially disassembled P-51 that had brought such unexpected changes to their lives. "Dad, what do you think?" Tommy asked, his young voice serious beyond his years. Edward thought of Sarah, his late wife, who'd always encouraged him to dream bigger, to take calculated risks in pursuit of something meaningful. He thought of the bills piling up on his desk, the uncertainty of their current situation, the opportunity to give Tommy advantages he'd never imagined possible. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes life offers us chances to become more than we ever thought we could be. The question is whether we're brave enough to take them." That night, long after Tommy had fallen asleep, Edward sat at his kitchen table with legal pads covered in calculations, scenarios, and questions. The business plan Tori had presented was thorough, but it represented a leap of faith that would change everything about their lives. Outside, Desert Rose waited in the hangar, her restoration half complete, a bridge between the past and an uncertain but potentially extraordinary future. Sometimes, Edward reflected, the most important decisions couldn't be made with spreadsheets and logic alone. Sometimes you had to trust that the right partnership, built on shared values and mutual respect, could overcome any challenge. The question was whether he had the courage to bet everything on that belief. The moving truck pulled away from Collin Aviation for the last time, leaving tire tracks in the gravel and an echo of emptiness that seemed to reverberate through the Millbrook Valley morning. Edward stood in the doorway of what had been his home and workshop for 8 years, Tommy's small hand tucked securely in his, both of them watching their old life disappear around the bend in the country road. "It looks smaller already," Tommy observed, his 8-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of transitions. The hangar that had seemed vast when filled with their tools, workbenches, and dreams now appeared diminished. Just another empty building waiting for new purpose. "Funny how that works," Edward replied, though his throat felt tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. Excitement and terror wrestled in his chest as he looked at the keys to Cascade Field in his palm. Keys that represented either the opportunity of a lifetime or the most expensive mistake he'd ever made. The decision had come together faster than he'd expected. 3 weeks of sleepless nights researching business models, aviation regulations, and insurance requirements had led to a single moment of clarity. Either he trusted Tori's vision and his own abilities, or he spent the rest of his life wondering, what if Sarah would have told him to take the leap he knew? She'd always been the brave one in their marriage, pushing him toward challenges that seemed impossible until he proved they weren't. "Mr. Edward!" Maggie Patterson's voice carried across the empty hangar as she approached with a picnic basket and tears she was trying unsuccessfully to hide. "I brought sandwiches for the road, and don't you dare say you're not hungry." Edward accepted the basket gratefully, along with the fierce hug that came with it. Maggie had been Tommy's unofficial grandmother since Sarah's death, and leaving her behind felt like abandoning family. "We'll call every week," he promised. "And you're always welcome at Cascade Field, always." "You better," she said, ruffling Tommy's hair with shaking hands. "And Tommy Collin, you remember your manners with all those fancy aircraft owners you'll be meeting? Your mama raised you right, and your daddy's gonna make her proud." The drive north to Cascade Field took 2 hours through Oregon countryside that gradually shifted from the familiar farmland of Millbrook Valley to the more forested hills approaching Portland. Edward had made this journey twice before. Once for the initial inspection with Tori, and again for the final walkthrough with lawyers and real estate agents. But today felt different. Today he was driving toward his new life as co-owner of a 40-acre aviation facility that still seemed too good to be true. "Dad, are you nervous?" Tommy asked from the passenger seat, his attention divided between the changing landscape and his father's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. "Terrified," Edward admitted, finding honesty easier than false confidence. "But sometimes being scared means you're doing something important." "Miss Tori says fear is just excitement without proper planning." Edward smiled despite his anxiety. Over the past month, Tori had become a regular presence in Tommy's life, helping with homework when Edward worked late, teaching him about business principles through age-appropriate examples, and somehow managing to be both authority figure and friend. Tommy had taken to her with an ease that both warmed and worried Edward. His son deserved stability, not another adult who might disappear from his life. The entrance to Cascade Field appeared around a curve marked by weathered stone pillars and a restored 1940s military sign reading, quote, "United States Army Air Forces Training Command." The main gate stood open, but Edward stopped anyway, needing a moment to process that this was really happening. Beyond the gate, a paved road led to a complex of buildings that looked like something from a World War II movie, Art Deco hangars, a control tower with period-appropriate windows, and administrative buildings that had been lovingly maintained despite their age. "Wow," Tommy breathed, pressing his face against the passenger window. "It's like going back in time." The main hangar doors were open, revealing Desert Rose in her new temporary home while construction crews finished the specialized restoration workshop. But it was the figure working beneath the P-51's wing that made Edward's pulse quicken. Tori, dressed in coveralls and safety glasses, her auburn hair pulled back as she carefully sanded primer from the wing's leading edge. "She's already here," Tommy observed, with the matter-of-fact tone children use for stating the obvious. Edward parked beside a late-model pickup truck that still bore Ashworth Digital Solutions magnetic door signs, evidence of Tori's own transition between worlds. As they approached the hangar, he could hear her humming something classical, a habit he'd noticed during their work sessions at his old shop. The sound made the vast space feel more like home. "The restoration crew," she said without looking up from her work. "I wanted to get a head start on the wing repairs before they arrive next week." "You didn't have to," Edward began, but she cut him off with a look that had become familiar, the expression of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be argued out of it. "Edward, we're partners now. That means we share the work." She gestured around the hangar, with pride that was infectious. "Besides, I've been waiting my whole life to have a proper workspace. Look at this place." The hangar was indeed impressive. 40,000 square feet of clear span space, with modern electrical service, compressed air lines, and overhead cranes, capable of handling even the largest aircraft. Climate control systems maintained perfect temperature and humidity for delicate restoration work, while skylights provided natural illumination that made colors true and detail work less eye-straining. "The living quarters are ready too," Tori continued, pulling off her work gloves. "I took the liberty of stocking the kitchen with basics, and there's a bedroom set up for Tommy with a view of the runway. I hope you don't mind. I wanted you both to feel welcome from day one." Edward followed her to the residential section of the complex, amazed by the transformation that had occurred in just 3 weeks. What had been Spartan military housing during his previous visits had been converted into comfortable modern living space, while maintaining its historical character. Tommy's room featured vintage aviation posters and a desk positioned perfectly for watching aircraft operations on the field. "Miss Tori, this is amazing!" Tommy exclaimed, testing the bounce of his new bed before moving to the window. "I can see the whole runway from here." "I thought you might like that," Tori said, her smile carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd guessed correctly about an important detail. "There's also a workshop area in the basement where you can work on model airplanes or other projects." As Tommy explored his new room, Edward found himself standing close enough to Tori to catch the scent of her perfume mixed with aviation fuel, a combination that shouldn't have worked but somehow suited her perfectly. The transition from corporate executive to hands-on aviation partner had changed her in subtle but profound ways. She moved with more confidence, spoke with less corporate formality, and seemed to inhabit her own skin more comfortably. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for all of this. I know what you gave up to make this happen." "What I gave up was a life that felt like running in place," she replied, meeting his eyes with an intensity that made his breath catch. "What I gained was purpose. And a partner who understands that some things matter more than profit margins." The word partner still sent electricity through Edward's chest, carrying possibilities he wasn't ready to examine too closely. But standing in their shared hangar, watching Tommy explore his new home, feeling the satisfaction of meaningful work ahead of them, he could almost believe that some risks were worth taking. "The Heritage Flight Services sign goes up tomorrow," Tori said, breaking the moment before it became too charged. "Our first client consultation is scheduled for next week. A collector in Seattle with a 1944 Corsair that needs a complete engine rebuild." "A Corsair," Edward repeated, his mechanical mind immediately shifting to the challenges of working on the distinctive bent-wing fighter. Pratt & Whitney R-2800. Beautiful engine, but temperamental. "I knew you'd be excited," Tori laughed. "I may have oversold our capabilities slightly in the initial conversation, but I figured we'd learn as we go." That evening, after Tommy had fallen asleep exhausted by the day's excitement, Edward and Tori sat on the control tower's observation deck, sharing a bottle of wine while watching the sun set over their new domain. The runway stretched out before them, empty but full of potential, waiting for the aircraft that would make Cascade Field a destination for aviation enthusiasts from around the world. "Any regrets?" Tori asked, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. Edward considered the question seriously. He'd left behind everything familiar, committed to a business partnership with someone he'd known for less than 3 months, and bet his and Tommy's future on a dream that could fail spectacularly. But looking at the facility spread out below them, thinking of the meaningful work ahead, feeling the contentment that came from being exactly where he belonged, he found his answer. "None," he said simply. "For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I'm moving towards something instead of just surviving each day." As stars began to appear over Cascade Field, Edward realized that some leaps of faith weren't really about faith at all. They were about recognizing when the right opportunity aligned with the right partnership at exactly the right moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning curves, and the hard work of building something meaningful from nothing. But tonight, surrounded by history and possibility, he felt ready for whatever came next. 3 months into their partnership at Cascade Field, Edward found himself looking forward to evenings almost as much as the challenging restoration work that filled his days. Tonight was no different. He stood in the doorway of the main hangar, watching Tori guide Tommy through the delicate process of applying fabric dope to a control surface practice panel they'd set up for his education. "The brush strokes need to be even," Tori was saying, her voice carrying the patience of someone who discovered an unexpected talent for teaching. "See how the fabric accepts the dope differently depending on the direction? Your dad taught me that consistency matters more than speed." Tommy, now 9 and growing more confident around aircraft systems each day, nodded seriously as he worked. His small hands had developed surprising steadiness, and his questions about aerodynamics and engineering principles often impressed the professional restoration crew that Tori had hired to supplement their core operation. "Miss Tori," Tommy said, pausing in his work, "Dad gets that look again when he watches you work, the same one he used to get when Mom was fixing something complicated." Edward felt heat rise in his cheeks, grateful that neither Tommy nor Tori was facing his direction. His son's observational skills had always been sharp, but lately they'd become uncomfortably acute when it came to reading the undercurrents between the adults in his life. "What kind of look?" Tori asked, and Edward could hear the smile in her voice even though he couldn't see her face. "Like he's proud and worried and excited all at the same time," Tommy replied with the matter-of-fact tone he used for stating obvious truths. "Mom used to say it meant he was watching someone he cared about do something brave." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching aircraft, a low rumble that grew into the distinctive note of a radial engine. Edward stepped outside to see a pristine 1943 North American AT-6 Texan making its approach to Cascade Field's runway, its yellow and blue paint scheme gleaming in the late afternoon sun. "That'll be Colonel Harrison," Tori said, joining him in the doorway with Tommy close behind. "Retired Air Force. Flew everything from training aircraft to strategic bombers. He's bringing his Texan in for an annual inspection, but I suspect he really wants to see what we've accomplished with Desert Rose." The P-51 had been their showcase project, and rightfully so. After 4 months of meticulous restoration, she was nearing completion. Her silver skin polished to mirror brightness, her Packard Merlin engine purring with the smooth power that had once carried fighter pilots into combat over Europe and the Pacific. Tomorrow, Edward would conduct the final engine run-up before her first post-restoration flight, a moment he'd been anticipating with equal measures of excitement and nervousness. Colonel Harrison proved to be a man in his 70s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, but his eyes held the unmistakable warmth of someone who'd spent a lifetime around aircraft and the people who loved them. As Edward conducted the standard inspection of his AT-6, the colonel peppered him with questions that revealed both deep technical knowledge and genuine curiosity about their restoration philosophy. "Young man," the colonel said as they finished examining the Texan's engine compartment, "I've been flying for 53 years, and I can tell you that what you've built here is something special. The attention to detail, the respect for authenticity. It reminds me of the old days when aircraft were built by craftsmen who understood that lives depended on their work." "Thank you, sir," Edward replied, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "We believe these aircraft deserve to be preserved exactly as they were, not updated for modern convenience." "And Ms. Ashworth," the colonel continued, turning to Tori, "I knew your grandfather, flew with him during a training exercise in '44. He was a hell of a pilot and a better man. He'd be proud of what you're doing here." Edward watched Tori's face transform at the mention of her grandfather, the corporate mask that still appeared occasionally melting away completely to reveal the woman who'd found her true calling working with her hands in an aircraft hangar. "Did he ever talk about Desert Rose?" she asked, her voice carrying a vulnerability that made Edward want to step closer, offer support in some tangible way. "Called her his lucky lady," the colonel smiled. "Said she brought him home from every mission, never let him down when it mattered most. He used to joke that he was going to teach his granddaughter to fly in that airplane someday, when she was old enough to appreciate what she represented." The weight of unfulfilled promises hung in the evening air, and Edward found himself reaching for Tori's hand without conscious thought. Her fingers intertwined with his naturally, seeking comfort and finding it in the gesture that had become increasingly familiar over the past few weeks. "He's going to get that chance, in a way," Edward said softly. "Tomorrow morning, Desert Rose flies again, and Tori's going to be right there in the co-pilot seat." Tommy looked up sharply. "You didn't tell me Miss Tori was going up with you." "It was supposed to be a surprise," Tori said, squeezing Edward's hand before releasing it. Your dad's been giving me flying lessons in the evenings, after you go to bed. Desert Rose deserves to have family aboard for her first flight. The flying lessons had been Edward's suggestion, born from watching Tori's growing confidence around aircraft and her expressed desire to understand every aspect of what they were preserving. But the evening sessions had become something more than instruction. Quiet hours in the cockpit of their trainer aircraft, sharing stories and dreams while learning to trust each other with life-and-death decisions. "She's a natural pilot," Edward told the colonel, pride evident in his voice. "Smooth on the controls, good instincts, and she actually listens to instruction instead of trying to prove she already knows everything." "Unlike some pilots I could mention," Tori laughed, bumping Edward's shoulder playfully, "he's a terrible passenger when I'm flying. Worse than Tommy when he's trying to tell me how to drive." As Colonel Harrison prepared to depart in his Texan, he pulled Edward aside for a private word. "Son, I've been in the aviation business long enough to recognize something special when I see it. You've got a good thing here. The facility, the work, the partnership." He glanced meaningfully toward Tori, who was helping Tommy secure tools in the workshop. "Don't let complications get in the way of something that works this well." After the colonel's departure, the three of them settled into their evening routine. Tommy working on homework at the kitchen table, while Edward and Tori prepared dinner together, a domestic rhythm that had developed naturally over their months of shared living space. The arrangement was practical, they'd told themselves initially. Separate living quarters would have been expensive and inefficient. But Edward knew, and suspected Tori did too, that convenience was no longer the primary reason they chose to share meals, household duties, and quiet conversations long after Tommy had gone to bed. "Nervous about tomorrow?" Tori asked as they cleaned dishes together, their movements synchronized from weeks of practice. "Terrified," Edward admitted. "First flights are always nerve-wracking, but this one," he gestured toward the hangar where Desert Rose waited, "this one matters more than most." "She'll fly beautifully," Tori said with quiet confidence. "You've rebuilt her with more care and attention than she probably received when she first rolled off the assembly line." "And Edward?" She turned to face him close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Thank you for trusting me to be part of it." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities that went far beyond aircraft restoration or business partnerships. Edward found himself leaning slightly closer, drawn by the warmth in her eyes and the scent of her perfume, mixing with the familiar smell of aviation fuel and metal polish that had become the signature fragrance of their shared life. "Dad, Miss Tori." Tommy's voice broke the spell, practical and urgent. "I finished my math homework, but I need help with the science project about aerodynamics. Could you show me how wing loading affects lift coefficients?" They stepped apart, both smiling at Tommy's perfect timing and his unconscious use of technical terminology that would have impressed his teachers. As they gathered around his homework, explaining complex principles through simple demonstrations using napkins and salt shakers, Edward reflected on how natural this felt. This blending of family, work, and something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. Outside, Desert Rose waited in her hangar, ready for tomorrow's flight. But inside their shared home, something equally significant was taking shape. A partnership that had grown beyond business into something that felt suspiciously like the family Edward had thought he'd lost forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the test of whether their restoration work would translate into successful flight. But tonight, watching Tori patiently help Tommy understand the physics of flight while planning their next restoration project, Edward felt a contentment he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Some risks, he was learning, paid dividends that couldn't be measured in profit margins or business success. Sometimes the greatest rewards came from trusting someone enough to share not just work and dreams, but the quiet moments that made up a life worth living. The threatening letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that had started with perfect promise. Edward found it slipped under the main office door when he came in early to conduct final pre-flight checks on Desert Rose, the envelope bearing no return address and his name typed on expensive letterhead from Meridian Acquisitions Group. "Mr. Collin," the letter began, "it has come to our attention that your operation at Cascade Field may be violating several federal aviation regulations regarding commercial restoration activities. We represent clients with significant interests in the vintage aircraft market who are concerned about unlicensed competition affecting established businesses. We strongly advise you to reconsider your current business model before legal action becomes necessary." Edward read the letter twice, his coffee growing cold as he tried to process the implications. Heritage Flight Services had been meticulous about obtaining proper certifications. They were fully licensed, insured, and compliant with every federal regulation he could identify. But the letter's tone suggested someone with deep pockets and legal resources was looking for ways to shut them down. "Bad news travels fast in a small industry," came a voice from behind him. Edward turned to see a man in an expensive suit standing in the hangar doorway, his demeanor carrying the polished aggression of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than merit. "Can I help you?" Edward asked, instinctively positioning himself between the stranger and the restoration work area where several $1 million worth of client aircraft sat in various stages of completion. "Richard Blackwood, Meridian Acquisitions," the man said, extending a business card that Edward didn't take. "I represent several established restoration shops on the West Coast who are concerned about your rapid expansion into their market territory." Edward felt his jaw tighten. In 6 months of operation, Heritage Flight Services had built a reputation based on quality work and authentic restoration techniques. Their client list was growing through word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied aircraft owners, not through aggressive marketing or undercutting established businesses. "We're licensed, certified, and operating well within federal regulations," Edward said carefully. "If your clients have specific concerns, they should address them through proper channels." Blackwood's smile held no warmth. "Mr. Collin, you may technically be compliant today, but regulations can be interpreted differently when proper pressure is applied. Some of our clients have been in this business for decades. They understand how things work, who to call when problems arise." The implication was clear enough to make Edward's hands clench into fists. Someone was threatening to use political connections or regulatory manipulation to destroy what he and Tori had built. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced Tori's arrival, her arms full of paperwork and her expression shifting from morning cheerfulness to sharp concern as she took in the tension between the two men. "Edward? Is everything all right?" she asked, setting down her papers and moving to stand beside him, a gesture that Blackwood clearly noted with interest. "Miss Ashworth, I presume," Blackwood said, his tone taking on a different quality. "Richard Blackwood, Meridian Acquisitions. I was just explaining to Mr. Collin here that your little restoration shop is causing some concern among established industry players." "Our little restoration shop," Tori said, her voice carrying the ice-cold authority that had built Ashworth Digital Solutions, "is a fully licensed, federally certified operation that has never violated a single regulation. If your clients have legitimate complaints, they're welcome to file them through proper channels. If they're simply concerned about competition, they might consider improving their own services rather than threatening ours." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Miss Ashworth, you may have had success in the software business, but aviation is a different world. Accidents happen, regulatory problems arise, insurance claims get disputed. It would be unfortunate if your partnership with Mr. Collin here put his young son at risk." The mention of Tommy sent a surge of protective fury through Edward that he struggled to control. "Are you threatening my family?" "I'm simply pointing out that small operations like yours face many vulnerabilities," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Financial pressures, regulatory challenges, safety concerns. It might be wise to consider selling your operation to more experienced hands before such problems develop." After Blackwood left, Edward and Tori stood in the hangar's sudden quiet, both of them processing the encounter and its implications. Desert Rose gleamed in the morning light, ready for her first post-restoration flight, but the joy Edward had been feeling about the milestone was now overshadowed by the threat hanging over their business. "Who do you think he really represents?" Tori asked, pulling out her phone to research Meridian Acquisitions. "Someone who sees our success as a threat to their market share," Edward replied, though his mind was racing through other possibilities. "The vintage aircraft restoration market is small and lucrative. If we're taking clients away from established shops—" "Edward." Tori's voice was tight, with controlled anger as she read from her phone screen. "Meridian Acquisitions is owned by Continental Restoration Group. They operate 3 of the largest warbird restoration facilities on the West Coast, and their average restoration costs are 60% higher than ours." Edward felt pieces clicking into place. Continental had been in business for over 20 years. built their reputation on expensive, lengthy restorations that often included modern upgrades that purists like Colonel Harrison specifically avoided. Heritage Flight Services, authentic, reasonably priced approach, represented exactly the kind of competition that could threaten their dominance. "They can't shut us down through legitimate means," Tori continued, her business instincts engaging fully. "We're too clean, too careful about compliance. But they might try to create problems for us. Insurance issues, regulatory harassment, or worse." The morning's promise was fully shattered when Tommy's school called an hour later. The boy had become violently ill during first period and needed to be picked up immediately. Edward found his son pale and shaking in the nurse's office, complaining of stomach cramps and nausea that had come on suddenly during math class. "Probably just a bug," the school nurse said, but her eyes held concern that suggested she suspected something more serious. "Several children have been sick this week, though Tommy's symptoms are more severe than the others." Driving Tommy home, Edward's mind churned with possibilities he didn't want to consider. The timing seemed too coincidental. Threatening letter, intimidating visitor, and now his son suddenly ill. But surely no one would threaten a child over business competition. That was paranoia, the kind of thinking that came from too many sleepless nights, worrying about protecting everything he'd built. Back at Cascade Field, Tori had canceled the Desert Rose's first flight and was pacing the hangar like a caged animal, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke in the crisp, authoritative tone that meant serious business was being conducted. "I've got 3 lawyers researching Meridian and Continental," she told Edward as he carried a still pale Tommy to his room. "And I've called our insurance company to make sure all our policies are current and comprehensive." "Tommy's sick," Edward said quietly, settling his son in bed with extra pillows and a thermometer. "Started right after Blackwood left. Could be coincidence, but—" Tori's face went ashen. "Edward, you don't think they would actually—" "I don't know what to think anymore," he admitted, exhaustion and worry making his voice rough. "All I know is that 6 months ago, we were struggling but safe. Now we're successful. And suddenly we have enemies who know where we live, where Tommy goes to school, how to find us when they want to deliver threats." That evening, after Tommy had fallen into a fitful sleep, Edward and Tori sat in the kitchen going through security options with a gravity that felt surreal. Motion sensors, camera systems, restricted access protocols, the vocabulary of people who'd never imagined needing protection from their own success. "I could sell my shares back to you," Edward said quietly, the words tasting like defeat. "Take Tommy somewhere safe, start over with a small repair shop where we don't threaten anyone's business model." "Absolutely not." Tori's response was immediate and fierce. "Edward, we've built something important here. We're preserving history, providing authentic restoration services, giving aircraft owners an alternative to corporate shops that treat warbirds like profit centers instead of pieces of history. I won't let bullies destroy that. Even if it puts Tommy at risk?" Tori was quiet for a long moment, staring at the security camera footage from their newly installed system. When she spoke, her voice carried a determination that reminded Edward why she'd been successful in the ruthless world of technology startups. "Especially then," she said, "because if we let them win through intimidation, what kind of world are we leaving for Tommy? One where bullies get their way, as long as they're rich enough to hire lawyers and threaten children." Outside, Desert Rose waited in her hangar, her first post-restoration flight postponed but not canceled. Around them, Cascade Field represented everything they'd worked to build, a place where history was preserved, craftsmanship was valued, and dreams could take flight. But as Edward checked the locks one more time and reviewed the security system settings, he couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenges lay ahead. Success, he was learning, came with a price that went beyond hard work and financial investment. Sometimes it attracted the kind of attention that turned dreams into targets. And protecting what you'd built required different skills than building it in the first place. The question was whether their partnership was strong enough to weather whatever Continental Restoration Group might throw at them next. The federal inspector arrived without warning on a foggy Thursday morning, his clipboard thick with citations, and his expression suggesting he'd already decided Heritage Flight Services was guilty of whatever violations he'd been sent to find. Edward watched through the office window as the man methodically photographed every aircraft in their facility, taking notes with the thoroughness of someone building a case rather than conducting a routine inspection. "Edward Collin?" The inspector's voice carried the authority of federal bureaucracy backed by unlimited time and resources. I'm Inspector Walsh, FAA Certification Division. We've received complaints about your operations compliance with Part 145 Repair Station Regulations. Edward accepted the inspection notice with hands that he kept steady through force of will. After 3 sleepless nights researching Continental Restoration Group's political connections, he'd expected something like this. What he hadn't expected was the scope of the alleged violations. Everything from improper documentation to unauthorized modifications, charges that could shut them down permanently if proven true. I'd like to see your airworthiness certification records, maintenance logs, and employee qualification documents. Walsh continued, settling into what was clearly going to be a lengthy process. We'll also need to examine your parts, sourcing procedures, and quality control protocols. Tori emerged from the restoration workshop, her coveralls traded for the crisp business attire she wore when dealing with serious corporate challenges. Edward saw her take in the situation at a glance. The federal inspector, the stack of paperwork, the gravity of whatever was unfolding. Miss Ashworth, I presume, Walsh said, consulting his notes. You're listed as co-owner of this facility. I'll need to review your aviation credentials and certification to operate a commercial repair station. My partner handles all technical certifications, Tori replied carefully. I'm primarily responsible for business operations and client relations. Without proper aviation credentials, your involvement in operational decisions could constitute a violation of federal regulations, Walsh said, making another note. We'll need to examine the extent of your participation in aircraft maintenance activities. Edward felt the ground shifting beneath their carefully constructed business. Every decision they'd made, every process they'd developed, was being viewed through a lens of suspicion that turned normal operations into potential violations. The inspector's questions revealed an intimate knowledge of their procedures that could only have come from inside information. Someone had been watching their operation closely, documenting their methods, looking for any crack that could be widened into a fatal flaw. Dad, what's happening? Tommy's voice drew their attention to the boy standing in the workshop doorway, his face still pale from the mysterious illness that had lasted 3 days before disappearing as suddenly as it had arrived. Just a routine inspection, buddy, Edward said, though the reassurance sounded hollow even to him. Why don't you work on your model airplane project while we handle this? But Tommy's sharp eyes had already cataloged the tension in the adults' faces, the official nature of the inspector's presence, the way Tori's hands were clenched at her sides despite her calm expression. At 9, he developed an uncomfortable awareness of how quickly their life could change, how external forces could threaten everything they'd built. The inspection continued for 6 grueling hours, with Walsh examining every aspect of their operation with microscopic attention to detail. He questioned their parts, sourcing procedures, demanded explanations for restoration techniques that prioritized authenticity over modern convenience, and challenged documentation processes that met the letter of the law but apparently not his interpretation of its spirit. These fabric repair techniques, Walsh said, examining their work on a 1941 Stearman biplane, appear to deviate from standard-approved methods. Can you provide manufacturer authorization for these procedures? Edward felt his patience fraying. Those techniques are period-correct restorations based on original military manuals from 1941. The aircraft is being returned to its exact wartime configuration. Without modern certification, such techniques could be considered experimental modifications requiring special authorization, Walsh replied, photographing their work from multiple angles. The original military procedures may not meet current civilian airworthiness standards. By afternoon, the scope of potential violations had grown to include everything from inadequate employee training records to improper storage of hazardous materials. Each citation carried significant fines and potential license suspension, the kind of regulatory nightmare that could bankrupt a small operation, while larger competitors weathered the legal storms with teams of attorneys and compliance specialists. There's something else, Walsh said as he prepared to leave. We've received allegations that your facility is operating without proper environmental compliance. The EPA will be conducting their own inspection next week to evaluate hazardous waste disposal and air quality issues. After the inspector departed, Edward and Tori sat in the office surrounded by copies of citations and notices that represented potential fines exceeding $200,000. The carefully organized business they'd built was being systematically dismantled by regulatory challenges that would have been manageable individually but were overwhelming in combination. "This is coordinated," Tori said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "FAA, EPA, probably OSHA next week. Someone with serious political connections is using federal agencies to destroy us." Edward's phone rang, displaying the number for Colonel Harrison. The elderly pilot's voice carried an urgency that made Edward's stomach clench with new dread. "Son, I'm calling to warn you about something. Word's spreading through the vintage aircraft community that Heritage Flight Services is under federal investigation for safety violations. Some of my friends are reconsidering their restoration contracts, worried about getting caught up in regulatory problems. Colonel, we're being targeted by competitors who—" "I believe you, Edward, but perception matters in this business. If the aviation community thinks your operation is unsafe or non-compliant, clients will disappear regardless of the truth. I'm not pulling my Texan because I doubt your work. I'm pulling it because my insurance company is demanding I move it to an uncompromised facility." After hanging up, Edward stared at the phone that had delivered their death sentence. Without client trust, Heritage Flight Services couldn't survive, no matter how successfully they fought the regulatory challenges. Continental Restoration Group had found the perfect weapon: federal agencies that could destroy their reputation while maintaining complete deniability. "We're finished," he said quietly. "Even if we win every appeal, fight every citation, prove that we're completely compliant with every regulation, the damage is done. No one will trust us with their aircraft while we're under federal investigation." Tori was quiet for a long moment, staring at Desert Rose through the office window. The P-51 sat ready for her first post-restoration flight, a testament to their skills and dedication that might never get the chance to prove their capabilities. "Not yet," she said finally. "I've been in corporate warfare before, Edward. This feels like desperation, like someone who's afraid of what we represent. They wouldn't be trying this hard to destroy us if we weren't a real threat to their business model." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Continental Restoration Group has made one critical mistake," Tori replied, her expression taking on the calculating intensity that had built her software empire. "They've underestimated what we're willing to do to protect what we've built together." That evening, while Tommy slept fitfully and security cameras monitored their property, Edward and Tori worked late into the night. But instead of preparing responses to federal citations, they were researching something else entirely: Continental Restoration Group's own compliance history, their client relationships, and the business practices that had made them desperate enough to wage regulatory warfare against a smaller competitor. "Look at this," Tori said, pulling up inspection records on her laptop. "Continental failed their last EPA inspection but somehow avoided penalties. And here, client complaints about overcharges and unnecessary work that were quietly settled out of court." Edward leaned closer, studying the documents that painted a picture of a company that had grown comfortable cutting corners while using political connections to avoid consequences. If this information became public, it would level the playing field considerably, Tori finished. "The question is whether we're willing to fight fire with fire, or if we try to win this through purely legitimate means." Outside, fog rolled across Cascade Field, obscuring the runway where Edward had planned to watch Desert Rose take her first flight. Instead, he was learning that sometimes the greatest battles weren't fought in the sky, but in conference rooms and federal offices, where the weapons were paperwork and political influence rather than skill and dedication. The war for Heritage Flight Services had begun in earnest, and Edward was no longer certain that being right would be enough to help them survive. The war room that had once been Heritage Flight Services conference area buzzed with controlled activity as Edward's unlikely alliance assembled for their counterattack. Colonel Harrison sat at the head of the table, his military bearing evident as he coordinated what he dubbed Operation Desert Rose, a campaign to expose Continental Restoration Group's corrupt practices while defending Heritage Flight Services' reputation. "The Pacific Northwest Warbird Association has agreed to support us," announced Sarah Mitchell, an aviation journalist whose investigation into restoration industry practices had uncovered a pattern of complaints against Continental. 37 vintage aircraft owners are prepared to go on record about Continental's overcharging, unnecessary work, and pressure tactics. Edward looked around the table at faces that represented everything he'd come to value about the aviation community. Besides Colonel Harrison and Sarah Mitchell, they'd been joined by Tom Bradley, a former FAA administrator who'd grown disgusted with his agency's susceptibility to political pressure; Maria Santos, an environmental lawyer who specialized in defending small businesses against regulatory harassment; and Dr. Rebecca Chen, a forensic accountant whose analysis of Continental's financial records had revealed suspicious patterns that went far beyond simple business competition. The timing of the federal inspections is too convenient to be coincidental, Dr. Chen was saying, her laptop displaying financial data that painted Continental's desperation in stark numbers. Their revenue dropped 18% in the past year, directly correlating with Heritage Flight Services' growth. They're hemorrhaging clients to competitors who offer authentic restoration at fair prices. Tori leaned forward, her business instincts engaged fully despite the stress of the past week. What about their political connections? Someone with serious influence coordinated those simultaneous agency investigations. Tom Bradley grimaced, his insider knowledge of federal bureaucracy adding weight to his words. Congressman Hayes sits on the Transportation Committee and has received significant campaign contributions from Continental's parent company. His chief of staff made calls to regional FAA and EPA offices the day before your inspections were scheduled. That's not just business competition, Maria Santos said, making notes for the legal brief she was preparing. That's corruption of federal regulatory processes for private gain. If we can prove the connection. We can, Sarah Mitchell interrupted, pulling out a folder thick with documentation. I've been investigating Continental for 6 months, following complaints from aircraft owners who felt they'd been systematically overcharged and pressured into unnecessary work. But what I've found goes deeper than simple fraud. She spread photographs across the table showing restoration work that made Edwards' professional standards recoil. Modern avionics crammed into vintage panels, aluminum patches covering original fabric, engine modifications that destroyed historical authenticity, while adding unnecessary complexity. They're not just overcharging clients, Sarah continued. They're systematically destroying the historical integrity of the aircraft they restore. Every airplane that leaves their facility is permanently altered from its original configuration, turned into a modern hybrid that looks vintage but has lost its authentic character. Colonel Harrison's voice carried the authority of someone who'd commanded men in combat. This isn't just about business competition anymore. Continental is destroying aviation history for profit, one aircraft at a time. If we don't stop them, in 20 years there won't be any authentic warbirds left, just expensive replicas with modern guts. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a fog. Edward thought of Desert Rose, still sitting in their hangar with her authentically restored systems, waiting for a first flight that had been postponed by regulatory harassment. She represented more than just successful restoration work. She was a piece of living history, preserved exactly as Captain James Ashworth had known her during the war. "What's our strategy?" Edward asked, though he suspected he already knew. The evidence was overwhelming, the moral imperative clear. But taking on an established company with political connections would require resources and determination that could consume everything they'd built. "We go public," Tori said firmly. Sarah's article, backed by Colonel Harrison's association, supported by Dr. Chen's financial analysis and Maria's legal brief. We expose Continental's practices, their political corruption, and their systematic destruction of aviation heritage. The risk is enormous, Tom Bradley warned. If Continental survives this attack, they'll come after you with everything they have. Federal investigations will look like friendly visits compared to what a cornered corporation with political connections can do. Edward felt the familiar weight of making decisions that would affect not just his own future, but Tommy's safety and security. His son was upstairs doing homework, blissfully unaware that his father was preparing to wage war against forces that could destroy everything they'd built together. "Dad?" Tommy's voice from the doorway surprised everyone. The 9-year-old stood there in his pajamas, his sharp eyes taking in the serious faces around the conference table. "Are we in trouble because of the airplane work?" Edward opened his arms, and Tommy came to him immediately, settling on his lap with the trust that made every difficult decision worth the risk. "We're fighting some people who think they can bully us out of business, buddy. It's going to be challenging, but we're not backing down." "Like when David fought Goliath?" Tommy asked, his Sunday school lessons providing a framework for understanding adult conflicts. "Exactly like that," Colonel Harrison said with a smile that transformed his stern features. "Except this time, David has friends helping him with his slingshot." Over the next hour, they finalized their strategy with the precision of a military operation. Sarah's exposé would run simultaneously in 3 aviation publications, timed to coincide with the release of Dr. Chen's financial analysis and Maria's legal brief to federal prosecutors. Colonel Harrison's association would organize a press conference featuring aircraft owners who'd been victimized by Continental's practices, while Tom Bradley would provide inside knowledge of how regulatory agencies could be manipulated for private gain. "There's one more thing," Tori said as the meeting began to break up. "Desert Rose's first flight. We've postponed it twice because of Continental's harassment, but I think it's time to make a statement." Edward understood immediately. A public demonstration that our restoration work produces airworthy aircraft, not just pretty museum pieces. Exactly. And we invite everyone, aviation press, aircraft owners, federal inspectors if they want to come. Let them see what authentic restoration looks like when it takes to the sky. As their allies departed into the night, each carrying assignments that would determine Heritage Flight Service's future, Edward and Tori sat alone in the quiet conference room. The documents spread across the table told a story of corruption and greed that went far beyond simple business competition, but also of ordinary people willing to fight for principles that mattered more than profit. "Are we doing the right thing?" Edward asked, exhaustion making his voice rough. "Taking on Continental? Risking everything we've built? Potentially putting Tommy in danger?" Tori reached across the table to take his hand, her touch providing the comfort and strength he'd come to depend on during their months of partnership. "Edward, 6 months ago, I was a successful but empty person running a company that made money without making a difference. Working here, with you, building something that preserves history and honors craftsmanship. It's the first time in years I've felt like my life had real purpose." She gestured toward the hangar where Desert Rose waited. "Your grandfather-in-law didn't survive 12 combat missions so his airplane could be destroyed by corporate greed. Tommy deserves to grow up in a world where integrity matters more than political connections. We're not just fighting for our business, we're fighting for the principle that some things are worth preserving, regardless of the cost." Outside, security lights illuminated Cascade Field's runway, empty but full of promise. Tomorrow would bring the public culmination of their counterattack against Continental Restoration Group. The moment when all their evidence, all their allies, all their determination would be tested against entrenched corporate power. But tonight, sitting together in their shared workspace with Tommy safely asleep upstairs and Desert Rose ready for her maiden flight, Edward felt a certainty he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the odds. Some partnerships were strong enough to weather any storm, and some dreams were powerful enough to overcome any obstacle. The war for Heritage Flight Services, survival was about to reach its climax, but Edward was no longer afraid of the outcome. They'd built something worth defending, and they had the allies, the evidence, and the determination to see it through to the end. The Packard Merlin engine's 12 cylinders fired in perfect sequence as Edward completed his final pre-flight checks, Desert Rose's propeller spinning with the steady rhythm of precision engineering. 6 months after her restoration began, and 3 weeks after their war with Continental Restoration Group had reached its climax, she was finally ready for the flight that would prove everything they'd fought to preserve. The crowd gathered around Cascade Field's runway included faces that told the story of their victory. Sarah Mitchell stood with her camera crew, documenting the moment for the follow-up article that would chronicle how authentic restoration triumphed over corporate corruption. Colonel Harrison waited beside the runway with other members of the Pacific Northwest Warbird Association, their presence a testament to the aviation community's support for Heritage Flight Services' mission. Pre-flight complete, Edward announced over the intercom, his voice steady despite the significance of the moment. "Tori, are you ready for your grandfather's airplane to fly again?" In the co-pilot's seat, Tori wore Captain James Ashworth's original flight helmet and goggles, carefully preserved artifacts that had waited 79 years to return to their proper place. Her hands rested confidently on the secondary controls, months of flying lessons having prepared her for this moment when family legacy would merge with professional achievement. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice carrying joy that had been absent during the dark weeks of regulatory harassment and legal warfare. "Grandfather, this one's for you." The past 3 weeks had transformed their lives in ways none of them could have anticipated. Sarah Mitchell's exposé had triggered a cascade of investigations that revealed Continental Restoration Group's corruption ran far deeper than simple business competition. Federal prosecutors had charged 3 Continental executives with fraud, while Congressman Hayes faced ethics violations for using his office to harass legitimate businesses on behalf of campaign contributors. But the most satisfying vindication had come from the aviation community itself. Within days of the article's publication, Heritage Flight Services client waiting list had grown to 18 months, with aircraft owners specifically seeking the authentic restoration approach that Continental had tried to destroy. The regulatory citations that had threatened to bankrupt them were quietly withdrawn, as federal agencies distanced themselves from what had become a national scandal. "Tower, this is Desert Rose requesting clearance for takeoff," Edward radioed, using the call sign that honored both the aircraft's wartime service and the woman who'd made this moment possible. "Desert Rose, you are cleared for takeoff runway 18, wind light and variable, visibility unlimited, welcome back to the sky." Edward advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the Merlin's 1,200 horsepower translate into forward motion that pressed them back in their seats. Desert Rose accelerated down the runway with the eager grace of an aircraft built for flight, her restored systems performing exactly as her designers had intended 8 decades earlier. At rotation speed, Edward eased back on the controls, and Desert Rose lifted into the Oregon sky with the fluid motion of a bird returning to its natural element. The crowd's cheers were audible even over the engine noise, but Edward's attention was focused on the instrument panel where every gauge showed perfect operation. Oil pressure steady, cylinder head temperatures normal, fuel flow balanced across all systems. "She flies like a dream," Tori said, her voice filled with wonder as she watched the countryside spread out below them. "I can almost feel Grandfather's presence up here, like he's flying with us." Edward banked gently to the left, beginning a circuit around Cascade Field that would showcase Desert Rose's restoration to the gathered crowd. But more than demonstrating their technical skills, this flight represented something deeper. The preservation of history through authentic craftsmanship, the victory of integrity over corruption, and the power of partnership to overcome any challenge. "Look at Tommy," Tori said, pointing to the runway where the 9-year-old stood beside Colonel Harrison, his face turned skyward with pure joy. "He's been waiting for this moment almost as long as we have." The boy had weathered their crisis with remarkable resilience, understanding that sometimes adults had to fight for principles that mattered more than immediate comfort. His questions about justice and fairness during the darkest days of regulatory harassment had reminded Edward why the battle was worth fighting, why some things couldn't be compromised regardless of the cost. As they completed their second circuit of the field, Edward's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. "Desert Rose, this is Continental One requesting permission to observe your demonstration flight." Edward and Tori exchanged glances of surprise and suspicion. Continental One was Richard Blackwood's personal aircraft, a modified P-51 that embodied everything Heritage Flight Services opposed. Modern avionics crammed into a vintage airframe, performance modifications that destroyed historical authenticity, restoration work that prioritized flash over substance. "Continental One, you are cleared to observe from a safe distance," Edward replied carefully. "Maintain 500 feet separation." The sleek aircraft that appeared off their starboard wing looked superficially similar to Desert Rose, but Edward's trained eye could see the differences that separated authentic restoration from corporate customization. Continental One's paint scheme was too perfect, her lines altered by modern modifications, her character lost beneath layers of expensive upgrades that missed the point entirely. "Mr. Collin, Miss Ashworth." Blackwood's voice carried none of its previous arrogance. "I wanted to personally apologize for Continental's actions, and to congratulate you on your victory. Perhaps we could discuss some form of cooperation between our organizations." Tori's response was immediate and diplomatic. "Mr. Blackwood, we appreciate your apology, but Heritage Flight Services will continue to focus on authentic restoration that preserves aviation history rather than modernizing it. We believe there's room in the market for different approaches to serve different client needs." The gracious but firm rejection reflected the confidence that had grown from surviving Continental's attacks and emerging stronger. They'd proven that authentic craftsmanship could compete successfully against corporate efficiency, that principles didn't have to be sacrificed for profit, and that sometimes the right partnership could overcome any obstacle. After Continental One departed, Edward and Tori continued their demonstration flight, putting Desert Rose through gentle aerobatic maneuvers that showcased her restored performance capabilities. The P-51 responded to every input with the precise authority that had made her legendary among fighter pilots, her systems operating with the reliability that had brought Captain Ashworth home from 12 combat missions. "Time to land," Edward announced as they completed their final pass over the field. "Desert Rose has proven herself worthy of her heritage." The landing was smooth and confident, Desert Rose touching down on Cascade Field's runway with the grace of an aircraft that had reclaimed her rightful place in the sky. As they taxied back to the hangar, Edward could see the crowd gathering to welcome them home, their faces reflecting the joy of witnessing something truly special. Tommy was the first to reach them as they shut down the engine, his excitement bubbling over as he helped them from the cockpit. "Dad, Miss Tori, that was amazing! She flew like she was dancing with the clouds!" Colonel Harrison approached with tears in his eyes, his weathered hands touching Desert Rose's wing with reverence. "Captain Ashworth would be proud," he said simply. "You've given his airplane back her soul." That evening, as the last of their guests departed and Cascade Field settled into peaceful quiet, Edward and Tori sat on the control tower's observation deck, sharing a bottle of champagne and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Desert Rose sat in her hangar below them, her restoration complete, and her flying capabilities proven beyond doubt. "What happens now?" Tommy asked, joining them with hot chocolate and the practical curiosity that had characterized his approach to their entire adventure. "Now we build the future," Tori said, pulling the boy close. "Heritage Flight Services becomes what we always dreamed, a place where aviation history is preserved through authentic restoration, where craftsmen like your father can practice their art without compromise, where aircraft can be returned to their original glory." Edward looked at his son and the woman who had become so much more than a business partner, feeling a contentment that went far beyond professional success. "And now we become a family," he added softly. "All three of us, building something together that's worth more than any business plan or profit projection." As stars began to appear over Cascade Field, Edward reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter with a broken corporate jet had led to the restoration of a legendary fighter, the defeat of corporate corruption, and the discovery that some partnerships could overcome any challenge when built on shared values and mutual trust. Tomorrow would bring new clients, new restoration challenges, and the ongoing work of preserving aviation history for future generations. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of work well done and love freely given, Edward knew they'd built something that would endure long after the last warbird had been restored and the final flight completed. Some legacies, he'd learned, weren't measured in aircraft restored or profits earned, but in the lives touched, the principles upheld, and the dreams kept airborne through dedication, integrity, and the courage to fight for what matters most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.